And there's 3 slides in this short videoette, or whatever you call these short videos, but they contain quite a bit of information. So have a look at each one carefully. I'm going to provide a kind of meta-narrative, drawing attention to the key concepts and principles that are embedded in each of the videos. You may notice my face is not in the corner. I think you've seen enough of me, and it's not going to enhance the learning process. So let's have a look at the main differences between quantitative and qualitative research. Now, remember, when you do research, if you remember going back to the paradigm, we talked about the nature of reality, which is ontological issue. Then we talked about epistemology, the relationship between the researcher and the subjects or actors or participants, whatever you want to call them, and the particular stance that is taken when we're in different paradigms. So let's take that first. So that's essentially 1 and 2. From a quantitative point of view, the idea, remember with positivism, one should be detached and therefore distant. The idea is that you create better objectivity, you don't influence the research process. Whereas in qualitative research, the very nature of the paradigm, the interpretive constructivist paradigm, it's actually not possible to do this. It's subjectivity and the way you interact with the respondents is going to influence the research anyway. So it's a much more close type of relationship. And similarly with the stance, as a quantitative researcher, you're an outsider. As a qualitative researcher, you are inevitably an insider. Now, if we move on to number 3, the relationship between theory, the concepts, and research, that from a quantitative point of view, we usually start off with an hypothesis or a specific question. And what we're trying to do is to kind of confirm the hypothesis or refute it, in other words, a non-hypothesis. Whereas with qualitative research, it's a much more emergent. We might start off with a research question or a research area of interest, but as we start to immerse ourselves in the research, talking to participants, observing, getting an understanding of the situation, the nature and focus and questions being asked may change. So that's what we mean by emerging. Now, if we look at 4, 5, and 6, this is essentially our methodology, research strategy, and the kind of view we have about the nature of the kind of findings that we see, and the view of social reality that we have. And essentially, from a research strategy, methodological point of view, it tends to be highly structured, the controlled experiment being an exemplar of that. And formal questionnaires, the nearest to that, sometimes in social research. In contrast, from a qualitative point of view, yes, there will be structure, but there is a greater emphasis on flexibility. So there's always, or should be, the potential for a more unstructured approach. So there's a kind of merging of the two. It's a flexible concept. The scope of the findings with quantitative research, it tends to be more general, whereas with qualitative research, more specific to understanding how a group of people are feeling, perceiving reality in that context. So the view of social reality from a quantitative point of view is one of being external to the actor. In the research process, it's an external reality. From a quantitative point of view, is there's always a social construction of reality, made famous by Berger and Lachman's book called The Social Construction of Reality. So the reality is socially constructed by the individual, and when you are researching individuals and groups and interacting with them, it is not just an individual construction, but a social construction in the sense that you are influencing the nature of that reality. So when we talk about the nature of data itself, from a quantitative point of view, it tends to focus on hard, reliable data that fits a kind of positivistic model. Whereas in qualitative research, yes, we want to improve and enhance our understanding of something, and this is a valid thing, but it's not going to be an algorithmic type understanding. So we seek a kind of rich, deep understanding, so we can come out of the research with some useful heuristics. Okay, so that's a more difficult thing in the last line. Now, if we then go to the methods, this should make natural connections that qualitative methods are more likely to involve semi-structured interviews, open interviews, focus groups, participant observation, observation itself in a more naturalistic sense, providing narratives about the nature of what's going on, and looking at artifacts like journals and diaries that we might be putting together, but the participants have, and capturing aspects of reality directly through videos, audio tapes, and participant stories. So you can see there's a more holistic, more flexible, essentially qualitative type of approach, and that's what I call qualitative methods. Now, invariably, the quantitative method, structured interview, structured observation, sorry, wrong way round, but same thing, questionnaires, pre-coded, attitude scaling, field experiments, and surveys using combinations. Now, the big note point is at the bottom that these categories are broad classifications of methods. In practice, divisions are blurred, often they're combined. And the idea is really to look at what methods across this menu of methods, across these broad classifications, will give you the best insight, in other words, the most valid and useful data, given the access that you've got and the time constraints. So hopefully that makes that connection between the paradigms and the types of methods, and the fact that the paradigms themselves can be, in a sense, blended to some extent. There are different opinions on this, but the mainstream opinion is that the paradigms are organising frames and the methods are a menu of useful tools for collecting data that is key part of doing research. And let's go to the last slide. Okay. Different uses of the methods. Again, see the connection that if we're talking about the method of observation in a qualitative research session, we'll take that one first, it's actually fundamental to understanding social behaviour. But from a quantitative point of view, it's often only something that's done preliminary. Well, what have we observed here? And let's then start constructing our questionnaire around things that we think we want to test out. Now, textual analysis, in other words, looking at information in text, again, the difference is significant. Let's take the quantitative first. It's content analysis. It's counting numbers of responses that fit into our predefined categories. Whereas from a qualitative point of view, it's understanding participants' categories. In other words, what are they saying about the thing that we want to study, if it's a flipped classroom? And how do we then create categories around their responses? So it's a much more what's called grounded theory approach. We don't impose the categories necessarily. We let them emerge as we collect data. Same with interviews. It's going to be more open-ended in qualitative research and more pre-coded fixed response in quantitative research. And as far as transcripts are concerned, us writing up our views, our framing of what we're studying, in quantitative research is not used that frequently. And it's just about checking perhaps the accuracy of our interview records. So it's a more kind of quality check, whereas with qualitative research, it's more fundamental to the research process itself, to actually pull together and try to make meaning of what participants really mean in terms of their language and their body language. And we have to recognise that this is particularly challenging as we try to avoid our own subjective views coming into play. And that's what makes this a very challenging part of qualitative research. But it's recognised that bias is inevitable, but as we'll see later in the tutorial, there's ways to perhaps reduce the level of subjectivity and to work towards a more objective, regulatory ideal type position of post-positivism. There's some people question whether this is really possible. So it boils down to, is there such thing as better or more rigorous qualitative research? And that becomes an advanced organiser for us to look at later. Okay, I hope this doesn't create a cognitive overload, and you can go through this a number of times in your own time, think about it. And there'll be opportunities to get feedback from me and other people who are going through this tutorial. So we will fill in any gaps collectively concerning how this all ties together.